the issue raised in that BBC broadcast has been swirling around for many years amongst those versed in the detail of this case. There have been suggestions by people very close to action, including the Bosnian ambassador to the United Nations at the time, Hamid Shashabeh, that the West knew of and gave what he's always described as an amber or even a green light to the Serbs for the taking of Srebrenica. Not, of course,
the massacre,
expecting the massacre. No, not for the massacre, just for the taking. And that the problem, he would argue, lies in the fact that having known about, having given it an amber or green light, they were thus fixed with knowledge that the takeover was going to happen. And they're therefore hugely embarrassed by the massacre that followed, and may have, in one way or another, not allowed this evidence to surface in the way that it could or should have done. Now, his evidence on that, and he was very close to the ground at the time, is supported by various other bits of evidence. For example, you can find in a Dutch report Al Gore making it plain that he was reading, Al Gore, the then vice president, making it plain he was reading from transcripts of intercepts they had of telephone conversations between Milosevic and Mladic at about this time. So, if indeed there was knowledge going to Milosevic that Srebrenica was going to be taken, was this information available to the West through intercepts? If it was their failure to act significant? Was it consistent with their willing acceptance, as Mohammed Shashabeh would say, that an amber light can be given to the taking? Now that was not obviously, it was an issue that once I became alive to it in prosecuting the Milosevic case, I sought to investigate. The people present at that meeting were identified in the Dutch report on Srebrenica. None of them gave evidence, and some of the contacts that I was able to have with people present were confidential. But nevertheless, some were simply not available to me on any terms.
So let's just go back, though, to the events of 1995, Sir Geoffrey. There were three Serb-held Muslim enclaves that were supposed to have UN protection, Žepa, Gorazda and Srebrenica. As we know, and it was a very infamous and shameful event, the Dutch troops failed to protect the people of Srebrenica, and they allowed, as you say, General Ratko Mladic, who was the Bosnian Serb general at the time, Karadzic was his right-hand man from a civilian point of view, he ordered the separation of the Bosnian men and boys from the women, and then, as we now know, the Bosnian men and boys were taken away and they were killed. But why would, and at the time the UN, the Bosnians were pleading that better powers be given to the UN troops in Srebrenica so they could fire back and protect the people. Why do you think, if those stories are true, why did these Western powers allow Srebrenica to fall? Okay, albeit they might not have known that Mladic's intention was to kill the people there, but why would they have allowed it to go?
There was no suggestion that they knew that a massacre was going to follow, and it would be ridiculous to, on the present state of evidence, to allow that possibility to be canvassed. Why might they allow the enclaves to fall? Why? Because they were three small enclaves in otherwise Serb-held territory, and it was proving impossible to hold them and impossible to maintain a proper way of life for the people who were living there. And there may have been, as again is something covered in various people's evidence on the topic, there may have been an agreement, implied or otherwise, that territory yielded in the east, namely these enclaves, would be in some way compensated for by territory gained in the west, where there was other fighting. And so that's one reason. Now, of course, if you want to look for a far more cynical reason, then you would have to consider that there was some desire on the part of the West, whatever we mean by the West, to favour the Serbs over the Muslims. For that, there is some very disturbing material around. If you look, there's a recent series of interviews recorded by a journalist, of interviews he had with President Clinton at the time, where, although Clinton retained the tapes of the interviews, the journalist has written about them from his contemporaneous notes. And he would say, or he does say in his book, that Clinton made clear that the West was not keen on having a Muslim state in the centre of Europe, and indeed that no less a country than Great Britain was urging for the dominance of Christianity in Europe. Now, who knows? These are all pieces of material that one must be careful about putting together to form a conspiracy theory. The thing about conspiracy theories is they are nearly always, very nearly always, wrong. But if you've got a number of bits of evidence that require an answer and that aren't answered because material is kept locked away by governments, because people won't speak to prosecutors when they're trying to present these cases at international courts, then the question remains. And so far as this issue was concerned, in my efforts to get all the evidence in The Hague in the Milosevic trial were unsuccessful. I was never able to complete that task. Efforts to get hold of intercepts were, how should I say it, thwarted.
Right.
Efforts to get some of the critical witnesses, for example, Carl Bildt, who saw Milosevic only a couple of days before Srebrenica happened, were, how shall I put it, unsuccessful.
And what about last week? We were covering the Karadzic trial because he was boycotting it, obviously, and we spoke with one of his legal advisors, and he is insisting, as no doubt Karadzic will whenever he does appear, he is insisting that a deal was done when the Dayton Peace Agreement was forged, and the deal was done around 1995 between Richard Holbrooke, who of course was the key figure who brokered the Dayton Peace Agreement, and Milosevic and other people in Belgrade, that Karadzic would remain free, that he would not be captured and put on trial if he stepped down as leader of the Bosnian Serbs. Now, of course, as we know, Richard Holbrooke has always denied those allegations. But what would be your own views? Do you think, as certainly some people believe, that that deal was actually done?
I would have thought that some implications of an arrangement were given to Karadzic. His behaviour ever since and until the time of his surrender would strongly support that. But the detailed nature of it I wouldn't know. But even Holbrooke himself, I think, has used terms, I can't remember them precisely now, that would imply that something was said. Incidentally, of course, Holbrooke, if your listeners are interested in, and if it's still on the web, I don't know, it was the Newsnight programme of about 2 or 3 weeks ago that dealt with this. And on that programme, on your first topic, they capture Richard Holbrooke making a statement about his being instructed in respect of the enclaves and whether they should stand or fall in a very dramatic way. He has published a correction saying that he didn't say what he is thought to say, but your listeners, if it's still on the internet, may find that a very interesting passage of evidence to look at, as they ask themselves the question, not, was this a conspiracy, what happened, but as they ask themselves the preceding question, are there big questions left about both the fall of Srebrenica and indeed about the any deal with Karadzic and Holbrooke, and what these things reveal.
And in that piece, and it is, by the way, still available on the BBC site for people to check out, Holbrooke says that Srebrenica was supposed to be sacrificed. Isn't that what he says? And then he had to come out and very strongly, I think he says he said it about something else at a different time. But just before we go, Sir Geoffrey, if that information became available, and if those conspiracy theories turned out to be true, that these deals were done, it wouldn't necessarily surprise people who were on the ground. Like, I was there for 3 years, and these were always the rumours that were flying around, that a deal had to have been done. What difference would it make in terms of our view of how Western powers intervene in foreign conflicts and indeed trials like those taking place at the moment in The Hague?
Well, I guess it might serve to remind thoughtful readers of the press and viewers of television and listeners to radio that although it's always tempting to see these things in very simple black and white terms, they never are.